Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're at the beginning of Parsha Shoftim, which in the Chumashim is chapter 16, verse 18. But I would like to begin with the Ramban's introduction to Parsha Shoftim. So if you're following along, it's before the Ramban on Yud Ches. So the Ramban says, as obviously the beginning of the Parsha instructs, that you should create judicial systems. You should set up judges and officers to enforce the judgments. And it says you should do it in all of your gates. So what exactly is this instruction? So the Ramban says, Siva b'Torah, ad hu Elohim yavod dvar shnehem, v'nosan b'flilim. At different places in the Torah clearly is speaking about taking something to a court. Talks about bringing the matter, doesn't mean to God, it means to a Beit Din. Talks about giving within a justice system. Im kain mitzvah sheyu Yisrael plilim. So it's understood from other contexts in the Torah that there has to be some type of judicial system. Ubir b'kan sheyasimu hashoftim b'chol areim kasheyitin lohem Hashem es haaretz ki b'chutz haaretz einam chayavim limlos lahem beis din. This is really interesting. The Ramban says, so he's bothered. So what is this pasuk telling me exactly? If the point of this pasuk is I have to appoint courts, it's self-evident I have to appoint courts because elsewhere the Torah talks about taking things to the court. So he says the point of the pasuk is, if you look closely at the verse, appoint for yourselves judges and officers in all of your gates, which God gives to you by your tribes. So the Ramban says what the Torah is teaching us is once they go into the land of Israel, they have a special mitzvah to appoint courts. That's why it says which God gives to you. Now, and that mitzvah is in every city there has to be a setup of a court. Aval kasher yitzak hama'uvas. I'm sorry, ki b'chutz la'aretz einam chayavim limlos dan beis din. Says the Ramban, there's not an obligation to have a beis din set up in the diaspora. Aval kasher yitzak hama'uvas yamtu alav haru'im lishbot v'mishpateim yishpatu. If there happens to be an argument, if someone feels they were wronged in some way, then it's appropriate for the community to set up a based in panel for the person to argue his case. That, of course, is true wherever the Jewish people find themselves. But this mitzvah of having a standing based in every city, that's only in Israel. V'hosif b'kan shotrim. And then, says Ramban, there's a new wrinkle here that has not been referenced in other places in Torah, and that's the concept of the officers. V'heim sheyunogsim b'dvar mishpat, that it's the role of the officers to enforce the judgments made by the judges. You know, you should know. I mean, it's a problem. It's a very real problem in our times. Every now and then, someone summons someone else to a beis din, and the two parties come, and one party loses, and the beis din says, "You know, you've got to give money, or you've got to do this, you've got to do that," and the person shrugged his shoulders and doesn't listen, and the parties. The other party is very disturbed. The other party says, well, how are you going to force him to listen to your judgment? And the answer is, we can't. What are you going to do? You know, so there are ways, but they're few and far between when you really think about it. And that's the fundamental difference between having shotrim and not having shotrim, having officers and not. So God says it's not enough to have judges. You have to have people to enforce the judgments. Obviously, in the secular society, the wonderful secular society in which we live, it's not our place to arrange, a vigilante network of people who will enforce the judgments of the local rabbis. That's not going to work. But the Torah says when you're living in a theological society, in a theocracy, you should have not only a Beit Din, but you should have officers to enforce the judgments of the Beit Din. V'hosif b'kan, I'm sorry. U'lefizeh ein Yisrael sheb'chutz la'aretz mitzuvim limnos lahem dayanim bar yaros. So the Ramban says, according to all this, it means that the Jews in the diaspora are not obligated to appoint courts. If people have an argument, you should set up a beis din for them. But the Ramban says this is all fine and well, but there's a complicated Gemara in Makos, because the Gemara in Makos says, based on the pasuk, that it should be for you a law for your generations in all of your places of residence. In all of your places of residence, that teaches that there should be a Sanhedrin, there should be a judicial court in Israel and out of Israel. Then why does it say in our pasuk, appoint judges in all of your gates? So according to the Gemara in Makos, it's different. According to the Gemara in Makos, every community, everywhere in the world, every Jewish community has to have a Beis Din. But the question is, how many, so to say? In other words, whereas in the diaspora, it's like per broad community, in Israel, it will be per city. In other words, there's responsibility to have more of a local Beis Din in Israel. That's what the Gemara in Makos seems to be saying. The Ramban goes on to say that for the record, even if you say that, when the Torah is talking about the mitzvah of having Beis Din, it's talking about people with full-fledged smicha. Scott, the Shabbos morning Gemara class, this has discussed that in different ways. I'm sure notes that people today don't have full-fledged smicha. So he says, today we really don't have this Torah mitzvah to begin with. But it's an interesting question the Ramban is addressing. There clearly is a special mitzvah in the land of Israel versus the diaspora. So according to one pshat, the special mitzvah is you have an obligation to have standing basins in Israel, but not in the diaspora. Where the other pshat, the point is you have an obligation to have more local standing basins in Israel, but even in the diaspora, you have to have local standing basins. An interesting thing. Okay, now just looking at this pasuk a little bit more, it says you should appoint judges and officers in all of your gates. Rashi says in all of your gates means all of your cities, which God gives to you by your tribes. So which one is it? Is the Beis Din set up by tribe, or is the Beis Din set up by city? Or both, whatever that's supposed to mean. Remember that in the land of Israel, the tribes lived in specific sections. So, you had the people of the tribe of Reuven lived more or less together. The people of the tribe of Shimon lived more or less together. So what does it mean that you should have it by your cities and by your tribes? So let's look at the Ramban. On pasuk Yud Ches, v'tam lishvatecha musav al ten lecha melamed shemoshivim Beis Din b'chol shevet b'shevet ub'chol year v'year lashon Rashi. So Rashi says this teaches that we do both. We do it by tribe and by city, and that's what it sounds like in Sanhedrin also. Says the Ramban. V'lo yadati perish davar zeh. I don't know what that means. Kikevan shemaninu Beis Din b'chol year v'year. Hare bati din and rabim b'chol shevet v'shevet. So I don't understand something. A tribe's geographical area encompasses numerous cities. So if you say that in every city you have to have a Beis Din, what do you mean every tribe has to have a Beis Din? What do those words even mean? You already have a number of Beis Dins throughout your tribal area because in each city you have a Beis Din. Ulai balomar shim ha'seir achas l'shnei shvatim b'Yerushalayim sheyesh b'chelik liYehuda Binyamin sheyoshiv ba shnei batei dinim v'kach helu b'perak chelek shecholkin ir achas l'shnei shvatim b'chein Yerushalayim ha'seir liYehuda Binyamin. So the Ramban is kind of stumped. So he says maybe what it means is every now and then you have a city that there's two sections of the city, and one section is held by one tribe and one section is held by another tribe. So like the city of Yerushalayim, Yehuda holds part of Yerushalayim, Binyamin holds part of Yerushalayim. So the Ramban says maybe what it means is that if there's a city that there's two tribal holdings in the city, each tribal area has to have its own Beis Din. Maybe that's the pshat. V'yitachin l'faresh shechiyev hakasuv limnos Beis Din al kol hashevet v'yishpot kulam v'achrei kain nimna Beis Din b'chol ir v'ir sheyishpot es ha'ir. So he says maybe there's different levels of Beis Din. Maybe each tribe has to have one Beis Din that's the grand Beis Din for the entire tribal area. And then on top of that, there's a lower level Beis Din in each city of that tribal area. They'd all be the same size. If they're dealing with a life and death case, it would be a Beis Din of 23. If they're dealing with a monetary matter, it would be a Beis Din of 3. Yismanu al-kol ha-shevet, v'tachteihem l'chol ir v'ir. But the idea is that the most prominent rabbis would be on the tribal Beis Din. Vein baalei adin nicholum lachuv zeh seh ladun, el b'fnei Beis Din shebe'iram, lo b'fnei Beis Din shebe'ir acheres. V'afilu hayu shnei baalei din be'ir acheres, yachol lomer neilech b'fnei Beis Din shebe'ireinu. Beis Nashevet Yachol Lachav Kol Anshe Shifto Lodim Lefanav Vafilu Hayinu Hadunim Be'iram Yacholom LeBeis Nagarosh Shevet Azilna. What would be the role of this grand Beis Din over the whole tribe? Well, imagine two people in the tribe of Reuven have an argument, okay? And they live in different cities. So whoever is the defendant can say, if you want to bring me to Beis Din, you have to come to the Beis Din of my city. That's fine. That's fine. And if they live in the same city, it can be assumed they can go to the same city. But the point is, either party always would have a right to say, I don't want to go to this Beis Din. I want to go to the grand Beis Din for the whole tribe. That would be the function of this Beis Din. V'chein, im nistapku batei dinin shal yaros yavol v'nei Beis Din hagarosh hashevet v'yishalu. Sometimes you have to go up the totem pole. Maybe a Beis Din, maybe one of the local Beis Dins isn't sure what the halacha should be. So they can take it to this grand Beis Din and pose the question. So that's what the Ramban suggests. So it's an interesting thing to think about. That basically, so he had one possibility that each city has its own Beis Din, and if there would be a city that there are different tribal sections in the city, then each tribe in the city would have its own Beis Din. But then he also says maybe the pshat is that each tribe has to have like a grand Beis Din, whether it be that it will field questions from lower ranking Beis Dins, whether it be that if people can't agree which Beis Din to go to, they can go to this big one. I just want to see one more thing. The Sforno on this pasuk, Sforno on Yudches. It's the second Sforno on the pasuk. No sein lechash bishvatecha. No sein lecha lishvatecha, that which God gives you by your tribes. Bisharecha shu no sein lach. In the gates that He gives you, shetachalik lishvatecha, that should be split up by your tribes. Lo b'meshet tichbosh chutz la'aretz she'eno mischalek lishvatim. So he says a really interesting thing. He says, let's say the Jewish people ever conquer land outside of Israel. Like, for example, there are holdings in the area that technically speaking, from halachic perspective, is considered Syria, but the Jewish land expanded to that area. But it wasn't in the basic definition of land that God defined as the land of Israel. That's not given out by tribe. So the Sforno says this directive on having Beis Dins throughout your cities is specifically in the land of Israel, specifically in the land of Israel given out by tribe. And that means if the land of Israel was ever expanded, this directive does not apply. Just another way of looking at things. So we discussed this morning what this even means to have a mitzvah, to have judges, and how it's a unique mitzvah vis-a-vis the land of Israel. And we discussed both with Ramban and the Sforno and Rashi what's meant by the courts being by city and by tribe. Is that redundant? Is that not redundant? Also,